Well, hello everyone, and my name is Ron Broglio. I'm a professor of English and the director of the Humanities Institute here at Arizona State University. The Humanities Institute supports research and creative engagement with what it means to be human in a constantly changing world. And this Tomorrow Talks series places thought leaders of today in conversation with the changemakers of tomorrow, that is, our students. And each distinguished speaker explains how they use humanities perspectives to address our world's most pressing challenges. Today, we welcome Siddharth Kara, author of The Zorg, A Tale of Greed and Murder that Inspired the Abolition of Slavery. Siddharth Kara is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, a two-time PEN American finalist, and New York Times bestselling author. He is a former British Academy Global Professor and has held academic positions at Harvard University, University of California, Berkeley, and University of Nottingham. In conversation with him is Arizona State University's own Cedrick Burrows. He's an associate professor here in writing, rhetorics, and literacy program in the English department. And his research focuses on cultural rhetorics and specifically Black rhetorics and its interpretation by mainstream culture. His book, Rhetorical Crossover, The Black Presence in a White Culture, earned the 2021 David H. Russell Award for distinguished research in the teaching of English by the National Council of Teachers of English. And his current research focuses on the reception of Black history narratives by mainstream audiences. Before we begin the program today, let me say how much I really enjoyed the Zorg. This has been my top nonfiction read of the year and one that I'm recommending to all my students and integrating into my classes, particularly the 18th, 19th century British literature and culture class. It's an incredible story and actually readable and accessible to a wide audience. So exemplary writing. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Siddharth Kara and Cedrick Burrows.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me pretty well? Okay. So I enjoy reading it as well. So I have one question before we get started. So I think I read in your bio that you're from Tennessee.
Yeah, I grew up in Memphis.
Me too. Yeah.
A small world. How about
Small
that?
world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So reading this and also it made me think about Memphis in some way because I remember talking to my grandparents when they were alive and they would talk about their grandparents and the things they went through with slavery. So it's one interesting telling people that it's not as far removed as we think it is. And also when reading this, I was also on my way to Charleston and Charleston with its own legacy of history with slavery and things as well. And so it made me think about all these things as I'm reading the book. So first question I had was what first drew you to the story itself and what made you want to research and write about it?
Well, I first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you and the students. I'm so happy to join you today. I had been doing field research for many years into modern day slavery in many countries around the world, and I'd written a few academically oriented books and then a more journalistic book about cobalt mining in the Congo called Cobalt Red. And it was after that book, and I took 5 trips to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to research that book, that I felt I needed a break from field research based writing. And this story had actually come into my mind many years earlier when I was doing background research for my first book. I came across the story of a ship called the Zong and this Captain Collingwood and the things that happened and the human rights movement that it inspired. And so when I thought, okay, I need a break from field research, but I have to keep writing, this story came back into my mind. And I thought, well, has anyone written a full book about this? Because I came across it in a law journal article. And I didn't really see anything much about it. And I started to look into it a bit more and more. And I realized there was a very interesting and perhaps compelling story that needed to be told.
Yeah, and I liked how interesting how in the beginning, reading it, it seemed to be that it started off with the need for sugar. And
Yeah, this what people have to uh, um, uh, understand was the slave trade was built on sugar. Sugar was the fossil fuel of the day. It was the rechargeable battery metal of the day. It was what drove the global economy back in the 16, 17, and into the early 1800s, when European countries crossed the Atlantic and found their New World colonies. The one thing that would grow in those really warm tropical environments that did not grow in Northern and Western Europe was sugar. But sugar requires an enormous amount of labor. And you just put two and two together, and then you have the birth of the Atlantic slave trade, and it fueled this centuries of accumulation, a century's worth of generational wealth built primarily on the sugar trade, and then later other New World commodities as well. But it was very much driven by sugar.
in some ways, I see some like parallels with modern culture now, because I'm thinking like with the cobalt in
Yes,
the Congo, things like that. And so how we use these products, but we never really understand how they're extracted, the labor involved in it, the exploitation, even how human beings are seen as things, and how once we learn about how we begin to change it. So like even the book was talking about how when people began to realize the depths of slavery in the Middle Passage, that's when things started to change.
that's exactly right, and that's why it was important to set the historical record straight on this book, because this is the journey that inspired that first movement to abolish slavery. And the first thing I had to set right was the name of the ship itself, because the historical record had the name of the ship wrong. It wasn't a British ship named Zong; it was a Dutch ship named Zorg. And so from there, as I peeled through the archives, I pieced together the story of what really happened on this journey. But it's not by accident that throughout history, the mode of production for the resources that the global economy desires at that time and that we consume are hidden from us. The conditions under which resources are extracted and labor is exploited are hidden from us because we need to be persuaded to keep consuming whatever it is that's being made. That's the whole point of all this. But when we learn, when the average person, not the profit hungry stakeholder at the top of the chain, but when the average person learns that there are enormous and atrocious violations of the rights and dignity of people associated with the production of this resource or this product, most people have a good heart and a good conscience, and a few have an extremely undeniable moral core, and they come forward as champions of humanity to drag us forward, say this must not stand, and a movement is eventually formed, and that in this case was the first movement to abolish slavery. Once people realized for the first time, thanks to the Zorg, what was actually happening on those slave ships.
Yeah, and it's also made me think about how we teach about slavery as well, that we teach about slavery itself, but never about the economics, for the most part, involved in it as well, that it's part of a larger thing with related to economic exploitation.
That's it. Wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty.
Mhm.
I mean, there are plenty of examples of cruelty throughout human history, but this was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was profit-driven dehumanization of an entire class of people, and it was very much driven. Every step in the trade was driven by the economics of it, and this erected the first global economy, where ships came from Western Europe with tradable goods down to West Africa, bartered those goods for people who represented labor, then transported those people across to the other side of the ocean and sold them into slavery, where they were then put to work primarily in sugar plantations, and then later cotton and tobacco, indigo, ginger, and other things. And then the products of sugar itself, but also rum, molasses, and so on, were then carted back to Western Europe and sold for a profit. And then that was the economic chain that was created starting in the 1500s and into the 1600s, and it fueled 3.5 centuries of a globalized economic slave trade that to this day, you walk around the capitals of Europe, and there are buildings named after these great slave traders, gilded in gold. There are scholarships to this day at major universities named after these slave traders. So the legacies persist, and of course, the impact on Africa persists.
Yeah, and then reading as well, thinking about that profit and how it basically created a whole economy for a lot of Europe. Because I noticed in the book that you mentioned like various companies and how basically they got started with slavery, like Lloyd's of London.
Yeah, so much of our modern, even our modern day economy, the principles of it were established during the slave trade. So insurance, for instance, was born out of the slave trade. Started in Lloyd's coffee shop, drawing up insurance contracts for slave ships and their cargo, and that eventually became Lloyd's of London, one of the most powerful and influential insurance underwriting companies in the world. The same with many financial institutions. They were born during the slave trade. So the global economy and much of the modern day insurance industry was born during the slave trade.
Yeah, and even with other things culturally, like you mentioned about the person who wrote Amazing Grace.
Yeah, yeah,
This,
yeah. John Newton's
mhm.
Newton is a fascinating character, and we get to him in that last chapter when we come to the abolition of slavery. And he was a slave ship captain. He captained several ships, was a participant in this indignity and this horror, and profited from it, and then retired and became a preacher and preached for many, many years and wrote some of the most famous hymns in all of Christianity, including Amazing Grace. And it was only 3 decades later, when this first abolition movement was sparked by the Zorg, then Newton had his sort of awakening and finally started to speak out against what he was once a participant in, and became a very prominent figure in the evangelical community and the abolitionist community in speaking out against slavery. And he could do so authentically as a former slave ship captain.
Yeah, because now I hear people held that controversy saying now we know about the origins of the person who wrote it. Should we still be singing these things? Or if you think about the businesses, should we still interact with these businesses knowing their legacy as well? But then it seems that it becomes very complicated.
It does, and I think these are personal questions that we all have to answer. I mean, one could see that hymn as some expression of regret and redemption,
Mhm.
and we come at it that way, or we reject it. I mean, I think there's no right or wrong answer to that. But the same, for instance, in now the world knows that cobalt and lithium and rechargeable battery metals are mined primarily by slaves and children in Africa. I mean, the world knows this now. Um, but each of us has to decide what to do with that knowledge. Some champions will emerge to try and set things right, but each of us must think for ourselves. Well, do I upgrade my phone every year now that I know what's in that battery, or do I wait a little while? I mean, I can't throw away my phone because we're completely dependent on them, and we've been made completely dependent on them. But we have to decide for ourselves, and there's no right or wrong answer to that question, I think.
And it shows the narrative itself has a lot of complexities with it as well, and even some cases contradictions. Because even in the narrative about the slave trade, that you also have Africans who were involved as well.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
wouldn't have worked if there weren't African rulers willing to sell their people into slavery in exchange for knives and beads, brandy, gunpowder, and pistols. There wasn't currency, tradable currency back then, so it was all tradable goods. So there were existing systems of slavery everywhere, 3, 4, and 500 years ago. What the Europeans did is they tapped into those existing systems of slavery in Africa and put them on steroids in order to fill the labor needs they felt they needed in their New World colonies. Now we have to remember, why wasn't there um, a native population of laborers in the Caribbean islands and in Brazil and the Americas? Well, in large part because the Spanish decimated those populations through war and disease. And so that's one of the reasons why Africans had to be carted thousands of miles across the Atlantic. If you think about it, it was a very inefficient solution to a shortage of labor. But that shortage was created in no small part because of war and genocide and disease brought by Europeans. And so their solution was, let's bring these Africans over to fulfill these labor needs because there's so much money at stake.
Yeah. And that even instead of like people think of Africa as now, but it's like they didn't consider themselves in their time. So it's kind of like having a lot of context
Yeah,
to really
yeah.
understand it. Yeah. And it's a very interesting topic. It's also a very heavy topic as well. So as someone who also writes about race and things, I also wonder, how do you take care of yourself emotionally while working on it?
Oh, that's a good question. And it can be very heartbreaking exploring these topics. Um, and I think the more empathy you have, the more difficult it can be. As I mentioned, I started with field research in dozens of countries around the world into slavery and child labor in the modern day context, and those encounters can be very debilitating, very heartbreaking. Um, and I learned early on uh, that I had to take time now and again, a break, a pause. In some ways, the Zorg was a break from field research for me. Um, but I also came to realize something very important. And I think I found strength in this realization that as hard as these encounters are, whether they're present day encounters or encounters with historical tragedy, the people who endured them suffered far worse than I ever will, just reading about it or talking to them about it. And most of those people found within themselves a great inner strength and persistence and dignity to survive, to persevere through all of these horrors and all this indignity and all this inhumanity. And if they can find the strength to endure, then surely I can find the strength to listen or to read about, because that's a far smaller task than it is to actually suffer the things I'm either encountering or reading about.
Yeah, so like one of my research areas is about museums, especially African American history museums. And so going to those sites and being on those spaces is that sometimes I just stand there by myself and just have to take it all in and think about what would have been like to be in those spaces at that time. And then realizing that I'm here now to write about it for people who never had a chance to tell their story.
Yeah, yeah, that's well said. That's very well said, Cedric, and it's so important. Um, I mean, when I was doing research for this book, most of it was, of course, archival, going through documents, thousands of pages of all these 250-year-old documents. But I also did go to West Africa because so many of the important intersections and historical flukes that took place for the Zorg were while it was trolling the coast of West Africa, acquiring slaves. And one thing I learned, for instance, is I thought, okay, the ships go down there, they acquire their 2, 3, 400 people, shove them into the cargo hold, and get on their way. But no, the process took months. You get 2 or 3 here, 3 or 4 there, 5 or 6 here. Now, the first ones you got a month ago have started dying, so you have to replace them. And so the whole process took months. And so the Europeans set up these castles and forts along the West African coast where they would accumulate slaves and hold them in dungeons so that when the captains came, they could come to the castle, like Cape Coast Castle, which was one of the stopping points of the Zorg in modern day Ghana, and pull the governor would pull out 20, 40, 50 slaves from the dungeon. Now, so you can go to this dungeon today, and you walk around in that place, and you feel the dread and the torment and the pain and the blood and the anguish of the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of human beings that were chained and held inside, forced to lay in their own filth, with barely air to breathe, hardly any light, almost no food. I mean, just the squalor and indignity of it. And so you realize the process of dehumanizing someone started all the way back on the continent before they ever made it to the plantation. And walking through those spaces is so important, as you've done, and as you just discussed, and then writing about it. Because I don't think we can have legitimate conversations about the impact and legacies of gross human rights violations like the slave trade until we fully understand and appreciate exactly just how extreme those violations were.
Here's what I appreciate about the book too is the description that you give about when they go into those forts or in the boats or things like that. That is very descriptive, but I feel like it's needed for people to really immerse themselves in what the experiences are. And I feel that one of the themes of the book is a reclamation of the humanity of the people who were involved with in terms of the slave trade. So how not only dehumanizes Africans who were going to be slaves, but also the shippers, the people who are the captains, everybody is dehumanized in different ways. And so, and we'll just talk a little bit more about this concept of humanization.
Yeah, I think it's so important because we can get lost in the historical facts and figures and numbers, and they become very vague and amorphous to us. Well, there were 40,000 ships across the Atlantic and 12.5 million Africans, roughly, stolen from their homes and taken across the Atlantic. And so you have these big numbers in your mind, and they're very vague and dehumanized. And one of the things I wanted to achieve with this book, because the story allows an author to achieve this, is to bring back the humanity and the grit and the detail of exactly what was happening. The malice of the captains, the oppression and exploitation of the sailors. Most of them didn't want to be on these ships either. They were rounded up as the dregs of society. No one in their right mind wanted to work a slave ship. They knew what the conditions were, that they were dangerous and perilous and miserable and risky, and that 1 in 5 of the European sailors didn't even make it back. This was knowledge at a certain point in time. But then, above all, the African people, who are this big, big amorphous entity in history. But when we take just one ship and its journey and the people on that ship, and if we know even a few details about them, then we can pull them out of that amorphous vagueness of history and make them real and human. And the Zorg allows us to do that. And a handful of people, in fact, even just one man and one woman, can stand and represent the millions. And suddenly they all have a face, and they're real and they're human. And when you feel that human connection, it deepens your comprehension of what they endured, of what that period of history really meant to everyone involved. Above all, of course, the African women, men, and children who were shoved into these slave ships. And if they were lucky enough to survive, ended up on enslaved plantations in the Caribbean islands or in the Americas.
Even then, if they got there, it still had a high mortality rate.
Oh, and
So
this
yeah,
is the other thing that we talk about in this country especially. We go to school, you learn about slavery and you learn about abolition in the American South and the abolition movement, of course, and the Civil War. But we learn, at least I didn't learn much about everything else, where they came from and how they got here and what that was like. And when you start to actually piece the journey together, it wasn't just that conditions on the plantation were horrific and had a high mortality rate. The mortality started 500 to 1,000 miles into the Sahel, where slave raiders would capture people and then march them. There were no trucks and cars and carts. March them for months to the coast because that's where the ships were coming. And a quarter of those people didn't survive. And then you get dumped in the dungeon and in the castles. And then a quarter of those people didn't survive. And then you get to the Atlantic Passage. And a quarter of those people didn't survive. Then you finally get to being a slave. And especially on the sugar plantations, within the first 3 years, 1/3 didn't survive. Now you aggregate all that mortality from the start to say year 3, and more than half the Africans didn't survive. And
yeah.
one of the things that one of the little details I uncovered, coming back to Newton, was he had a conversation with a plantation owner on a British island, saying, when he was a slave ship captain, you work these people so harshly, so crudely, and they barely survive. And we're hardly, as a British slave trading institution, bringing enough bodies back to replace the ones that are dying. Why not just ease back on the conditions, treat them a little better, so that. And the plantation owner, his summary was basically, yeah, we thought about that. We ran the numbers, and it's still economically more advantageous to work them to the bone and keep the new bodies flowing in. Now, a detail like that, and when you start to put a human face to it, as the Zorg journey allows us to do, tells you so much about the ruination associated with this period in history.
Yeah, because there's two quotes there in the book that I had to write them down because they stuck out to me. One was on page 172, where it says Africans were people, not property. They were humans, not horses. In a way, they were seen as things that basically were disposable. Because even going through their whole trek to get to the, I don't say castle, but the fort, is like if they couldn't keep up, basically they were just put on the side of the road and just left to die.
Yeah, and a
Uh,
Commodore, later says that the path to the coast is thick strewn with their bleached bones.
mhm.
Now, that's an adjective. Thick, not there's some bones here and some bones there. Thick strewn with bones. That tells you how many people were just left to the side to die, who just dropped and died. And that's just to get to the coast. But yes, when we come to the court case and this whole thing, what happened on the Zorg was an enormous and terrible act of inhumanity. But we frankly shouldn't know about it. We shouldn't know about it. What happened on that ship? There was no reason for us to know about it except for the greed of the slave merchant who couldn't tolerate the loss and then filed a legal case. And that allowed all of this to come into the open. And then that led to a legal hearing in front of the Chief Justice of the entire British Empire. And that created for the first time in history, in Western history, and certainly in a courtroom, this debate about are they people or property? I mean, this immensely consequential debate. Are they, as the quote is, were they people or property? Are they animals or people? This had to be tussled out in a legal contest, this question. And for the first time, there are arguments being made about concepts like universal human rights, that the black people are equal to the white people. This was the language they used, that they had as much right to existence as the captain of the ship. And that these arguments were being made for the first time is an astounding consequence of this slave ship journey and bent the entire arc of history. Because from that point forward, when the average person came to realize, wait a minute, what do you mean, are they people? Of course they're people. How can they not be people? Okay, maybe they're African people, but they're people. They're not a horse. And what do you mean they're property? And so you can just do this to them, whatever you want. That doesn't seem right either. The average moral person objected to that treatment of those people over there. And we're still having that fight. We're still having that fight in the global economy today, that those people over there are worth the same as our people over here.
Yeah, because then it's on page 183, where it's said that some of the blacks had to die to ensure that all of the whites survived. Such was the nature of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That this was their calculus. Now, it turns out there was some more convoluted greed-mongering plots afoot. But their initial argument was, well, we had to kill a bunch of them so that we could survive. And they were property, so that's okay. And the Chief Justice Mansfield, the sentence that went down in infamy, was the case of the slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard, because this is what they resorted to. They started throwing over Africans because they thought they were running out of water. So they thought, let's reduce the number of people who have to consume water. And the Chief Justice said, yeah, well, if they were horses who needed water, you'd throw them overboard. So Africans were no different. That's where we were at that point in history.
Yeah, I think there's one part in the book too where he said, okay, if this was, let's say, a series, you would go back to the page and where it talks about the rain.
Oh, so
It said,
that gets to the whole convoluted plot that was afoot that was really more about greed, because it turns out, and this came out in the court trial. It turns out they weren't short of water. Turns out that in the middle of throwing over slaves for the alleged shortage of water, it started to rain. And when that detail came out in the court case, you can imagine a scene in a movie. When I talk to people about this, I say, "Oh, did you see that movie, A Few Good Men, Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson?" And Tom Cruise is going at Jack Nicholson, and he just needs to get him to admit that he ordered the code red. Jack Nicholson's not doing it, not doing it, not doing it, and finally Tom Cruise has a choice to make: either back off or get him moving so fast and so angry that he admits it. And Tom Cruise does. Jack Nicholson does admit it, and then everything stops. Wait, what did you say? You did? And so there's a moment like that in this trial. Wait, you said that in the middle of throwing over these 130 plus Africans because you ran out of water, it was raining? Suddenly, in that moment, the entire slave trade was revealed to be a big, murderous fraud, a morally bankrupt lie. And that blew open the door to abolition, because now they had testimony, they had a testament, they had proof that the whole thing was a greed-mongering lie. The truth was they were throwing over the most sick and ill Africans because their compensation as officers was determined by the average sale price of the Africans who survived the journey. And if you want to boost that average sale price, you sell only the healthy ones. And they had taken so long to cross the Atlantic, and the ship was ridden with scurvy and disease, that if they took 150 desperately ill Africans who didn't even sell, their average price would be less, and so they would earn less. And so that was the truth that came out of this. The system was predicated, it was a morally bankrupt system of greed. And they finally had proof of it, and that sparked the abolition movement.
Yeah. And one more thing about the humanities that also, in reading it to the name Sia and Kojo, that having given them those names, it really made them, they were already people, but I was felt more invested in the story, because I'm thinking, okay, that because she was pregnant, she had the baby, and then Kojo, that he was trying to learn their language and he was trying to explain things that I'm thinking, okay, they must have survived the people who were going to be, but they weren't. And I like, oh, that I just want to talk about, like, say that rhetorically, just to give them a name, it really made them feel more human in that story.
Yeah, well, this is a choice I made, and I thought about it a lot, because when you look at, when you go to archives and you look at log books and slave captain ledgers, they just wrote down, because they of course documented all the slaves they purchased and what they paid for them, but it would just say female, rough age 30s, or female child, and they had a number: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's it. They had no names. All these millions of people in the history books have no names. And that was another way of dehumanizing them, erasing them. And I remember the day I was sitting in the British National Archives, as I didn't have this choice in mind initially. And I was studying what happened on the ship. And of course, you just don't have any voices of the Africans. And there are so few that survived historically. And I didn't know anything about them other than roughly sort of where they came from. And I remember there was a 3 by 2 foot parchment that I came across. And it was called The Answer of James Kelsall. He was the first mate on the ship. And he revealed 2 details about one woman who was pregnant, had a baby, and then she and that baby were thrown overboard. And then one about a man learned English and pleaded for his life in English to James Kelsall. And he reveals these 2 details. And those 2 details so affected me because they distilled, in a way, the entire 3.5 centuries of the slave trade into 2 moments. One, to look upon a woman and her baby and see nothing but property and throw that innocent life overboard with in the arms of her mother. Boy, that tells you a lot about dehumanization of people and greed and malice. Okay. And for the other man to say, look, don't have to give us food and water. We'll stop eating and drinking, but just don't throw us overboard. And the response was, he was the next man thrown overboard. Boy, that says a lot about the dehumanization and the hunger for profit and the malice associated with the slave trade. And you don't have to know much else about anybody, but those two moments with those two people. And so when I came across this, I thought, okay, those two people have to have a name. I'm not going to call them female 10. I don't even know what number she was. And male 15. I'm not just going to call them male and female. No, they need names because they represent the millions of men and millions of women and millions of babies and children. And so I made that choice. And I acknowledge it in the book that I am making this choice. I'm giving this person a female, a name for this reason, and she represents all of them. And so does he. And I think as I look back, I think it was a good choice because, as you said, it suddenly humanizes them. And then when you come to those moments, I think you really feel it more intensely. And that was the point of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. And one more question about, I guess, the aftermath of it as well, because in the second part, well, the latter part of the book, it especially focuses on the letter that was in the newspaper and how Equiano reads it and how it leads into more of the movement as well. And then you begin to research who wrote this letter. And so it's an epilogue as well. So I just wanted to see, can you just talk some more about that?
Yeah, when you sit down and read the book, you realize there are just so many fluke moments that had to happen in order for this story to emerge and to lead to this trial that revealed to the world the moral bankruptcy and greed of the slave trade that then inspired this first movement to abolish slavery. And this anonymous letter was one of them. There was actually a trial about this case, and there's no transcript. And the Chief Justice found for the slave merchants, and that should have been the end of it. That should have been the end of it. And being no transcript, we shouldn't even know what the trial was about. But someone was in that room that day, and there weren't courthouses back then. This was held in the London Guildhall, which was a town meeting where people are selling books and hustling and bustling, and in the corner were the high courts. Okay, and there was a man standing there that day, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Wait a minute, they're talking about property and insurance when 130 plus Africans were murdered. Why aren't they talking about murder? And this man writes an anonymous letter the next day that gets printed in the largest circulating newspaper in London when he's expressing these thoughts, okay? And for 2.5 centuries, nobody knew who wrote this letter. But it's important because Olada Equiano, a former slave who bought his freedom and made his way to England to fight for abolition, read this letter. And he read this letter, and the same day took it to the one man in England who could do something about it, named Granville Sharp. Granville Sharp is the first British-born person to devote his life to the abolition of slavery. And the two of them came together, and then there was the court case that we all know about now. But look at the flukes that had to happen. So the first thought I had was, well, who wrote that letter? We need to know who turned history in that moment. And how come no one's answered that question as of yet? I wanted to know. And I had some theories, and I talk about it in the epilogue. And I remember, first I thought I need to find this letter. And I remember the day, like that parchment, I found the letter in the British Library in this archived 240-year-old collection of the London Courant and General Advertiser. And there it was, the letter. I mean, you could still read the whole thing. And who wrote this letter? And I describe in the epilogue how I pieced together the puzzle of who wrote that letter and who we owe our gratitude and thanks to for having a conscience as he stood there that day and wondered, why are they not talking about murder? Because if he hadn't written that letter, I mean, slavery was going to be abolished. But this was the chain of events that led to it. And that anonymous letter and the man of conscience who wrote that letter were important to identify and acknowledge.
Thank you for it. Yep. So I think now we're shifting out to the student Q&A portion. So we have Lilia DeWolf, Hope Salinas, and Samantha Brearley. And so they're going to ask you a question now. So Lilia, would you want to ask your question? Oh, we can't hear you.
No? Good. Okay. I just wanted to say hi. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm so glad to meet you. My question, kind of as you guys were mentioning earlier too, was that Gregson and Gilbert case, kind of how initially it was like this, how human lives are treated as more of an insurance claim. And I think to me that was really shocking, especially. And how you mentioned also that it was like the first time that it kind of shifted into a humanitarian case. And that was really shocking because I'm thinking, wow, seeing this chain of events. So I guess my main question is, how do you think that shaped this like events legacy and how we think about justice today?
Yeah, thank you, Lilia. It's an important question. And the Gregson v. Gilbert, which was a contest between slave merchants and the insurance underwriters, was the first time that this shift took place in the minds of the public and in a court of law. And it's an astonishing moment in history. It really is, because for the preceding 2.5+ centuries, African people were treated as property by the slave traders. They were acquired with goods. They were insured. They had an insured value should they die during the passage. And then they were sold, and a deed of title was transferred in exchange for that sale. So they were property. They were property for centuries. And this moment in history, this pivot point, was the first time, at least the first documented time, where arguments were being made in a court of law that these were not, the Africans were not property, certainly not animals. They were humans. And when you read the court transcript that we have because of Granville Sharp, he hired a shorthand writer to write down everything that was said. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. There are just astonishing declarations being made by the barristers, arguing on behalf of the humanity of the African people. You see this again 50 or 60 years later when former President Adams is making arguments in the Amistad Supreme Court case. Same arguments coming up again. They're not property. You can't just return them to Spain. They're people with rights to liberty and life, and they had a right to defend themselves. And in this case, the arguments were they had a right to life, to water, to live. You did not have the right to just chuck them overboard like they were a chair or a dog or a horse because you thought you were running low on water. And we look back and think, this is astounding that people had to make that argument. But at that point in history, they did have to make that argument, and they had to win the argument in a context where for 2.5+ centuries, everybody thought of them as property. And it's when you think back, it's just an enormous triumph of goodness and morality and rigor in that moment of history. Now, that didn't mean that suddenly everyone changed their minds. In fact, to this day, some people still haven't changed their minds. But there was a triumph that at that point in history, and a spark that would lead to, and the first test case to say, no, not property, human beings. and how should human beings be treated? And that led, of course, to a range of arguments within the abolition movement to rid the world of this stain called the slave trade and slavery.
Thank you. And so next student we have is Hope Salinas.
Hi, I also really enjoyed reading your book. I thought it was very powerful and really appreciate you being here. My question had a lot to do with the power dynamics I found when I was reading the book and also that you had mentioned. Um, Kind of, I guess, just like what factors do you think contributed to those like power discrepancies that were within the Zorg, and that also aided like imperialistic and racist ideologies that were extremely prevalent throughout the history of slavery and during the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, Hope, thank you for your question and your kind words. There's the first European encounters with Africa were nothing particularly of note. Europeans went down looking for gold. They had heard about this fabled riches of gold in Africa, and land crossings, of course, were very challenging. Crossing the Sahara was almost insurmountable task, and their ships couldn't get south of the Canaries because of the strong currents, and it took time for them to figure this out. But the first encounters largely related to the hunt for gold. It was only once the New World was discovered and populated with plantations that then this labor relationship started. And as I said, there were existing systems of slavery within Africa that the Europeans simply tapped into and then amplified stratospherically because they needed bodies to feed this machine called a sugar plantation, which is some of the harshest work anyone could ever do at that point in history. Miserable work. If you're referring in terms of power relationships to the relationships on the ship, there's sort of a fascinating little world on a slave ship, and especially once it's out to sea, crossing the Atlantic. It's just this isolated little universe, and the captain is God, and that godlike power led to brutality, and that brutality went down the chain of power. So the captain first unleashed his brutality on his crew. They were right there all the time in front of him, and he could whip them, and he could beat them, and he could torture them if they didn't please him or made a mistake. The crew then passed that malice and brutality down to the slaves, because the crew was responsible for guarding the slaves, feeding them, cleaning them, and so on. So they had more direct contact with the African people on the ship. And that led to all kinds of brutality. Sexual violence ran rampant. One quote in the Zorg says one former sailor describes a slave ship as half bedlam, half brothel. Children were raped. Women were raped. I mean, it was, and that has very much to do with asymmetries in power. Absolutely. Women's bodies, especially. Even children. Equiano and Cugoano talk about girls, 9 and 10 years old, being raped by crew members on the slave ship in front of everybody. Newton talks about it. Gratifying their brutal passions. I mean, you can imagine what all was happening on those ships. So the power filtered down, and then, of course, the captains had every right to whip whoever they wanted, be it crew or slave. They talked about how they would quell insurrections. Insurrections were an effort to take back power. And roughly 1 in 10 slave ships had a major insurrection. I mean, Europeans got pretty good at knowing how to keep Africans chained and contained. And they set up a barricade down the middle of the slave ship so that if there ever was an insurrection, they could quickly retreat to the back of it and then shoot down the insurrecting Africans. But insurrections took place. This was an effort to take power back. One of the most important forms of resistance, that and refusing to eat. And insurrections captains developed ways of not just crushing them, but then deterring them from happening again. And one captain I talk about, I quote in the Zorg, says, well, the method we found most effective is to take the leader, chop him into pieces with our axe, and distribute that amongst the surviving slaves. And that tends to quiet them down from thinking about another direction. So now when you talk about power and power relationships, I mean, there was those asymmetries brought out the darkest and most brutal tendencies among some of the most horrible people. As remember, a lot of slave ships were crewed by former prisoners, the dregs of society, because they didn't want to be on those slave ships anymore. Well, maybe a little more than the slaves did, but they knew they were going to get whipped by the captain, paid peanuts, that there were 400 Africans who were waiting to try and kill them, rightfully so, at any moment in time. And they were going to end up also getting disease and scurvy and malaria and whatnot, and probably not surviving themselves. So that's some of the contortions in power that led to so much brutality on these ships.
Thank you. And now we have Samantha Brearley.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burrows, and thank you so much, Dr. Kara. This has been absolutely fascinating. I was wondering if you could tell us about the archival work that you've completed for this project, especially, I mean, the detective work that you did alone on the authorship of the anonymous letter. It's such a vast project, and you do such an incredible job of weaving in diverse sources. So can you share about the archival process, your approach to kind of making sense of such a vast array of documentation? And then, yeah, how you went about like choosing what to include, which stories to kind of weave in, all of that.
Yeah, Samantha, thank you. Those are very kind words. And it was a different kind of research for me than what I had done previously. And as I mentioned, very archival heavy. So most of the archives were in the British and Dutch National Archives. There's also the trial transcript is at the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. There was bits and pieces in the British Library. Almost none of this is digitized. So these are all 240-year-old handwritten documents. And, I had a starting point in the British National Archives where I went through the letter books from the Committee of Merchants Trading in Africa. These are the governors who ran the forts, and they documented all kinds of things, buying and selling slaves, which ships came and which ships went. And the governors who were part of this story, Governor John Roberts at Cape Coast Castle and Robert Stubbs, I have to, some of the funniest reader reviews, every now and again I go to Goodreads, and I'm curious how people are responding. And there's one review I'll never forget. It was very short. It said, "God bless Granville Sharp, F-bomb Robert Stubbs." That was it.
That's a kind way of putting how we feel about Stubbs. Yeah.
Yeah. That was it. And I thought, you got it. The book has succeeded. Okay. So, so I went to their old letter books and documents, and then really it was just one thread led to another. And I came across, oh, wait, now that's interesting. So now the Zorg was over there then. All right, let me go to that fort and let me figure out what was happening over there. And so now, okay, Stubbs, this guy's pivotal. I need to know and understand him. So then I'm looking at everything related to this guy to try to understand who he was and how he intersected with people. And then bits and pieces started. No logbook survived. So how do I piece together this story? Okay, I need to understand everything about what was normally happening on these slave ships and use those voices to try to portray this. And then but the Zorg was a Dutch ship. So what exists in the Dutch archives? And Jan Wilton, who was captain of the Zorg, his logbook didn't survive, but he wrote this really long letter to the MCC, Middelburg Commerce Company, which was the big slave trading company in the Dutch West India Company. And he wrote this long letter after the Zorg had been captured by the British, because there's a whole piracy thing happening as well. And so I had to piece together the piracy thing and how did that come to be? And he wrote this long letter about, well, I was just heading along and this happened and then this other ship came in. And so then I could piece that part together. And then that led to another thread and then another thread. And it was the same with trying to figure out who wrote the anonymous letter, just piecing together, okay, so I've got these two nuggets from the letter that give me a place and a rough time frame. all right, let me peel at this place and see what I can figure. Oh, there was this thing called the Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge. Okay, so what was that about? Now, so who would have been there at that point in time talking about this? And there's some reference to this guy who was working on a book. Oh, now what book might that have been? And that's sort of the detective work of archival research. And then you get to a point where you have this enormous mass of information. And if you put it all in, it becomes an unreadable mess. And you want to keep the reader moving along and not getting confused or bogged down or burdened. And so then that's the question. Ron used the right word before we started this, of curation, of what do I put in to keep to the most important details that tell the story without pulling the reader too far this way or that way, or getting them confused or lost, because the impulse is, wow, all of this is interesting and all of this is necessary. And I really want people to know this and that. But as you have to make choices, and then that's where a good editor also helps to say, you're really close to this, Siddharth. Let me tell you right here, this, either shove it in an end note or put it somewhere else. If you can't part with it, shove it in an end note. That's when all else fails, do that. So that you just keep the narrative going, because you want the reader to keep turning the pages and to complete this journey, because it's such an important journey.
Are there any, sorry, Dr. Burrows, I'm just sneaking one more in. Are there any stories that you found and really wanted to keep in the book and there wasn't space, or your editor said no? Is there anything that like kind of stays in the back of your mind, kind of sticks with you?
I mean, there's a few things. There was more about Liverpool, historically. The transformation of Liverpool as a direct consequence of the slave trade. And I went to Liverpool and I went to the dock area. And of course, it doesn't look anything like it looked back in the slave trade days. But the old dock, which was the world's first commercial wet dock, which is what catapulted Liverpool to, at its peak, capture 40% of the entire European slave trade. It went from this muddy fishing village that almost was wiped out from the map during the bubonic plague and struggled to survive. It went from this muddy fishing village to this maritime superpower and capital of the slave trade. And when you go to Liverpool today and you go to the docks, there's a whole bunch of little bits and pieces about the Beatles, and there's much less about the slave trade, but they have this fabulous International Slavery Museum. And that's another set of archives I went through. A lot of slave merchant letters to their captains, giving them instructions. I mean, and there's a whole world there about Liverpool and the history and the relationship between the slave merchants and the slave captains and the docks. That, I mean, people have written entire books on this. It's not a lot of new information there, but there was more I had in initially about that, because it is so fascinating, and most of those books are very academic or historian books that the average person doesn't pick up. And initially, I had more of that, but that I pulled out, because the more you put in Liverpool, you're just delaying your arrival to Africa, and when the story really gets started, which is in Africa and Stubbs and Collingwood and all of these people. So that's one example. There were some things, the events along the West African coast. The pivotal one, of course, is the Stubbs and everything he was doing, and when he insults Amune Kuna, who was the Kabakir of the Ashanti king, and that was the final sort of event that convinced the governors they had to get rid of this guy, and they happened to get rid of him on the day that the British ship was passing by, and that let Stubbs stand up on the Zorg. And there are a lot of episodes and stories like that about the relationship and dynamics between the Europeans who were there and the native African population, particularly the Fante and Ashanti people. Fascinating interactions, fascinating tales and stories, but just not related to this story, as interesting as they might be. So I couldn't put in, a lot of those things that I came across in my research.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time now, but Siddharth, thank you for a good conversation. thank you for the book itself. And I'm going to suggest this to a lot of people, recommend it to a lot of people, and also looking forward to your next work, which you say is a novel.
I'm working on my first work of fiction. Yes, trying something new.
Yeah, yeah. Looking forward to reading it when it comes out.
Okay, good.
All
Well,
right.
we'll have a conversation about that in a couple of years, maybe.
Good, good. All right. So also thank you to Dean Jeffrey Cohen, English Chair, Nush Powell for their support, and to Victoria Day and Alyssa Arns for their help organizing this event. Also want to thank Michael Fanian and the good folks at Macmillan Publishers for making these events possible. And finally, want to thank our incredible ASU teachers who work tirelessly to help ASU students imagine a brighter future. Thank you.